Alrighty. Hello, everyone. Um, let's see. All right, people seem to be flooding in. Um, it's so good to see everybody here. I am so excited to be here with the one and only Lev Grossman. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started, and then I will get out of your way. So thank you all so much for coming. My name is Olivia. I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books. For those of you who don't know, Belmont Books is an independently owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts, and we've been bringing books to the community since 2017. Before we begin, we have a number of awesome events coming up. On December 17th, we have Carol Hay and Shelby Devlin talking about Carol's new book, Think Like a Feminist. And on the 29th, we have our last event of the year, but we're going out with a bang with Eleanor Lippman and Caroline Leavitt talking about Eleanor's new book, Rachel to the Rescue. So you can register for those at the same place you registered for this one, belmontbooks.com, and that's also where you can purchase tonight's book, The Silver Arrow. I am so excited to introduce Lev Grossman. He is the author of 5 novels, including the New York Times best-selling Magician's trilogy, which has been published in 30 countries. A TV adaptation of the trilogy is on its 5th season on Sci-Fi. Grossman is also the award-winning journalist who spent 15 years as a book critic and lead technology writer at Time magazine, where he published more than 20 cover stories. In addition, he has written for New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Wired, Believer, The Village Voice, NPR, Salon, Slate, and BuzzFeed. He's joining us tonight from New York. And with that, Lev, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Um, Thank you so much. I don't know how many of you are on the East Coast, but if you are, I'm in New York City, in Brooklyn. I will report that the blizzard has arrived. It is unbelievably snowy outside. My children's school has already been canceled for tomorrow. They're incredibly excited. They may burst in here at any moment to tell you about the fact that they have a snow day. Hopefully, my wife can hold them off. I'm going to talk a little bit about The Silver Arrow, which is my first book for kids. I definitely did not start out writing children's books. I've actually written probably every other conceivable form of writing besides children's books. I wrote 5 novels for adults. I wrote a unsuccessful, unfinished dissertation. I wrote journalism for 20 years. I've written 2 screenplays, one of which is alive and one of which is dead. Um, I hesitated, I guess, before writing a book for children. There seemed to be it seems to be difficult to cross over between adult and children in both directions. Roald Dahl is one of my icons as a writer for children, and I know that he spent much of his life trying to cross over into adult fiction, and he never had the same success there. So it seemed like a slightly cursed thing to do to try to write a children's book. And I really only did it after I had children, and even then, what drove me to it was the fact that I would walk them to school every morning. It's about a mile from my house to my kids' school. And my kids would spend that mile punching each other incessantly. They just fought constantly. And the only way to make them stop fighting would be to tell them stories, which is where The Silver Arrow came from. I would like to tell you that The Silver Arrow was my children's absolute favorite story that I told them. In fact, it is my children's second favorite story that I told them. Their favorite story was the one. Let's see, they turned into animal superheroes. I think one of them was a hamster, and one of them was a caracol, which is apparently a kind of wildcat that can jump extremely high. I think this is a real thing and not a made-up thing, although I could be wrong. The hamster and the caracol have superpowers, and they fight Lex Luthor, who is stealing all the gold and silver from the Gotham Mint. That is their favorite story. As it turns out, Lex Luthor is the intellectual property of DC Comics, and they were uninterested in having me infringe on their intellectual property rights. So instead, I wrote The Silver Arrow, which I personally like just as much, and maybe even a little bit more than the Lex Luthor one. The Silver Arrow started as an image. I have talked to a lot of writers over the years about where their novels come from, and many of them say they start with an image. For me, that's very much the case. And in this case, the image was just of a train moving through a kind of darkened winter landscape. It was a steam train, and there was a girl on the train, all alone, nobody else on the train, and she's looking out the window. And it's very cold and dark outside in the forest, but it's very cozy and warm inside this train car she's in, which is a sleeping car. And it wasn't until after I finished The Silver Arrow that I realized where that came from. It actually came from Possum's Book of Practical Cats, that book of poems about cats by T.S. Eliot, which then got turned into a musical, namely Cats. My one of my life goals is to go through my entire life without ever seeing cats, and so far, I am on track. I have still not seen Cats, but I have read the book that it was based on, and one of the poems in that book is called Skimbleshanks, the Railway Cat, and I'm actually going to read just a little scrap of that poem because it's so good, and it really was the origin of this whole Sleeping Arrow, Silver Arrow story. Skimbleshanks is a cat who he is the resident cat of a train, and it's a sleeper train. So it has all these compartments with little beds in them, and there's a description of the compartments that goes like this: "Oh, it's very pleasant when you found your little den with your name written up on the door, and the berth is very neat with a newly folded sheet, and there's not a speck of dust on the floor. There is every sort of light. You can make it dark or bright. There's a handle that you turn to make a breeze. There's a funny little basin you're supposed to wash your face in, and a crank to shut the window if you sneeze." I always loved that passage. I read it as a child. When I became an adult, I had the experience of actually riding on a sleeper train. Some of you may know that John le Carré, the great spy thriller writer, passed away quite recently. I was once sent by Time magazine, my then employer, to interview le Carré, and I took the opportunity. I flew to London, and then I thought, well, I'm going to Cornwall because that's where le Carré lived. I'll take the sleeper train. And I did. I flew in late at night, and I changed to the sleeper train and took the sleeper train down to Cornwall. And I can tell you, real sleeper trains are nothing like the sleeper train in Skimbleshanks. I just lay there all night, freezing, completely unable to sleep, and feeling personally lied to by T.S. Eliot. And I arrived in the morning, having been awake for about 24 hours, and I went to John le Carré's house, and I promptly fell asleep in his spare room. It was it was a professional low point for me as a journalist. I wish I could say that it was the lowest point in my journalistic career. It probably was not, but it was a low point. He was very gracious about it and was probably the most charming man I ever interviewed. So that was the image that started the Silver Arrow. But of course, an image, it's not a story. Sadly, I had to go and do the work and figure out who this girl is. And I decided that her name was Kate, and she was about 11, and that she had been given this train on her birthday by her mysterious Uncle Herbert. Uncle Herbert, for some reason, is estranged from the family. She's never met him before, but on her 11th birthday, he turns up with a present for her, and I think she probably would have preferred to have Legos, but she doesn't get Legos. She gets a steam train, a real, live, huge, enormous steam train, and they set it up in the backyard, and then mysterious magical tracks appear, and she and her brother Tom get into the train, and they go off down the tracks into a mysterious world. So that was where the train came from, and then I had to figure out where it was going, which took several more months of walking to school with my kids and trying to stop them from hitting each other. And I realized, and this is there was another image came to me, and it was probably, it probably, when I say probably, I mean definitely, comes from another of my favorite things to read as a child, which was the Chronicles of Narnia. And the image that came to me was of a train station, an old-fashioned train station, just a just a platform with lights and one of those glowing clocks. But it's there in the middle of the woods, just like the lamppost in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And on the station are all these animals, and they're just sitting there, bears and foxes and wolves and whatever else. And each one has a ticket in its mouth. And the train pulls up to the station and stops and gives a big sigh of steam. And one of the animals, it's a fox, puts his ticket down and looks at the girl in the train and says, "You're late." And that's when I really felt like there might possibly be a story there. And it's a story that I told my kids. And the funny thing was, it went in a direction that I didn't expect. And this was the point where it got, to me, extremely interesting, because like when children's stories meet talking animals, like they do in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or James and the Giant Peach, it is generally the case that the animals are happy to see them. When the Pevensies show up in Narnia and they meet Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are psyched to see them because the kids are finally here, the humans, the sons and daughters of Earth, and they are going to save the day. Well, I wanted to tell a story like that. But when the children in my story met the animals, it was a very different conversation that took place. And it turns out you couldn't actually tell the story the same way, because a great deal has changed in the 60 or 70 years since the Chronicles of Narnia were published. Because now the animals, they're not necessarily that happy to see the children. From the animals' point of view, they're living in what feels like a post-apocalyptic world that is in the process of being destroyed. And the humans aren't here to save the day. The humans are the ones destroying it. So when Kate meets these animals, she feels as though, here she is, she's the hero of the story, and she's come to save the day. But to the animals, she's the villain. And that makes for a very interesting conversation. I did a great deal of research for this book. For some reason, I chose to write about two things that I know very little about. One of them was steam trains, and the other thing was animals. I live in Brooklyn. I rarely encounter animals. If I do, I usually run away. So I learned a great deal about both of them. The internet, I can tell you, it may have been invented for one purpose only, which was to serve the needs of steam train enthusiasts. No matter how much you learn about steam trains, there is always somebody on the internet who knows 10 times as much as you. And I learned a tremendous amount. And I'm going to tell you two things that I learned that did not go in the book. I put as much as I could in the book, but there were two facts that I found so disturbing and inconvenient that I left them out of the book. But I'm going to tell them to you now. The first one has to do with steam trains, which are just an incredible gift to a storyteller. What I realized as I was writing about this character in a steam train is that they move your character through the world, and they take you on adventures. But when your character gets sick of what's happening in the world, they can always go into the train, and there's a whole little world inside the steam train that they can explore. And furthermore, since this is a book and I can do whatever I want, you can make up whatever kinds of train cars you like. So Kate on her train has a candy car, for example, and also a library car, and also a mystery car, which nobody knows what's in it. And I didn't know what was in it when I started writing the book. I only found out about 3/4 of the way through the book, and you'll also find out if you happen to read the book. But there was one thing I learned about steam trains, which is that if you're writing a book about a magical steam train, obviously, at some point, what you want to have is the steam train going on a track like a roller coaster track that goes in a loop-the-loop. If you have a magic steam train, why would you not do this? So at some point it becomes necessary, who knows why, for the train to go on a huge loop-the-loop like a roller coaster, and then come out the other side, because that's what you would do if you had a magic steam train. Unfortunately, one of the things I learned about steam trains was that if you turn them upside down, they will explode. I found this fact so inconvenient and frankly disappointing that I left it out of the book. and I had my steam train do a loop the loop anyway. I guess it's a magic steam train that doesn't explode when it's turned upside down. And I'll tell you the second thing I learned. The second thing I learned has to do with pangolins. Pangolins are an animal that I was only peripherally aware of before I started writing this book. They are the only mammal that has scales. Um, and they are basically little critters that walk around eating ants and termites and things like that, and they're unbelievably cute. And they're covered with scales that basically look like fingernails, and they're incredibly precious. They're one of the most trafficked animals in the world, and so they're in a great deal of danger right now. And I also found them very cute, and that combination of them. It seemed virtuous of me to publicize the plight of pangolins, and also I found them very cute. So I put them in the book. There's a baby pangolin, in fact, which is even cuter. Um, and one of the things I learned about pangolins, I was halfway through the book, and I started putting things together in my head, and I realized pangolins, they have these incredibly long tongues. If you have a pangolin, its tongue is as long as the rest of the pangolin. Its tongue is as long as itself, and it sticks it out, and it gathers up ants and, you know, termites and whatever else it wants to eat. But pangolins have very tiny heads. They have these very sweet, small heads. And I thought to myself at some point, well, how does the pangolin actually fit the tongue inside of its head? It's got a tiny little itty bitty mouth. And then it's got this enormous tongue. What happens to the tongue when it goes inside the pangolin's mouth? Well, I found out. Here's what happens to a pangolin's tongue. When it's not using it, it goes back in its mouth, but it's not anchored in its mouth. It actually goes out of its mouth and down into its chest, where it sits, coiled up like a weird, sticky pink snake until it is needed. I found that fact, frankly, so disturbing that I didn't put it in the book, but I have shared it with you now. So you are welcome for that. But the rest of the facts that I learned, I put in, that included a lot of facts about the natural world and what is happening to it. One of the things I noticed about my kids, they're very interested in animals and the natural world, and they watch a lot of TV, unfortunately, shows like The Octonauts and Wildcrats. And one of the things about those shows, they never mention climate change. Animals definitely have a lot of problems, but it is never really confronted in a serious way that human beings are responsible for those problems and that those problems don't have easy or obvious solutions. And that, in fact, it is the challenge of the generation of people who are children now. What they will grow up into is this tremendous effort to try to restore the world to some kind of balance. Not the balance that was, because that's lost, but to find some new kind of balance. They have inherited a disaster that is not of their making. And in order to solve it, they are going to have to be smart and make sacrifices and think about humanity's place in the world in a whole new way that really nobody has ever thought about it in. And I realized that my children needed help with that. And I didn't know how to help except to write a story. And that's really what The Silver Arrow is. I tried to tell a story about this terrible task that awaits my children and everybody's children now. I don't know. I hope it'll help a little bit. That is the end of my talk. But my hope is that maybe you guys might have some questions, which I would be very, very happy to answer if they exist. Personally, in this situation, I never ask questions because I'm a very shy person. I will never open my mouth when I'm in a crowd. So I'm in awe of anybody who does, and also very grateful.
Personally, I was fascinated to learn that fact about pangolins. I did not know that. I love that they have very long, slimy pink tongues that they keep in their chest. I keep my heart there, but I guess if you want to keep a tongue, that works too. So we do have a couple of questions. One is from Evelyn. She says, hello. In future
Hello.
Silver Arrow installments, they would like to know, will we see more sentient machinery, boats, submarines, planes, maybe?
It's a good question. The train in the Silver Arrow, it really wasn't meant to be sentient, and no one was more taken aback when it started speaking to the people who were traveling in it. And I really had I had a long think about this. We have talking animals. Ought we to have a talking train as well, or is that, de trop? But I the train wouldn't shut up, so it stayed a talking train, and it's sentient. And well, I think it's only right if further machines in the world are sentient. I don't think all machines should be sentient. That just seems just like a disaster in the making. But the books are going to the story's going to continue. I have actually contracted to write another book in the Silver Arrow series, but I'm not supposed to talk about that. So nobody tell anybody that I just said that. But it's underway, and I seem to have I seem to have introduced a submarine into the story in the last pages of the Silver Arrow, which is something I have often heard about writers doing. They write something, and it's not planned as a series, so they just throw whatever they like in there. It was the case with the Magicians. Magicians was only going to be one book, and then I started writing more of them. And I put some stuff in there that then became challenging to deal with in the later books. But I suppose that's where the best stuff comes from. So there seems to be a submarine in the offing, and the submarine it will definitely have to have a personality. It will be very different from the Silver Arrow, because naturally it would be different. It's going to have a name. I can't even express to you the length of time it took me to come up with the name the Silver Arrow, although in retrospect it seems obvious. I went through a very many number of train names before I got to the Silver Arrow, and I have not even begun that process with the submarine. I welcome contributions from the crowd. I was on a Zoom call the other day with a whole bunch of second graders, and I solicited names from them for the submarine. They thought that I was just being nice. In fact, I was desperate for a name for the submarine.
Well, if you have
Um,
a good submarine name, absolutely let us know in the chat. We would love to hear them. I have
mhm.
another question
I
from
will also.
yes, yes, go ahead. Oh, I have another question from Aster, who is a very big Magicians fan. Um, and they would like to know what you're reading these days and if you have anything that you would recommend.
Oh, that's such a good question. Wow, that's such a good question. I always read. There seem to be two kinds of writers. Those writers who, when they are writing, they try to avoid reading other fiction because it sort of messes with their voice. And then there's others who read a lot. I like to read fiction while I am writing because it messes with my voice and makes it better. Because left alone, my voice, it seems very ordinary to me. But often, if I'm reading a good writer, some of that will sort of rub off on me a little bit. And let me think what I'm reading right now. For some reason, I'm rereading the plays of Tom Stoppard. Um, if you are a very assiduous Magicians fan, you will note the cameo that Tom Stoppard made in the third Magicians book. It's because I'm a big Tom Stoppard fan, and in fact, Arcadia is just one of my favorite things that has ever been written, absolutely ever. I'm reading a biography of Edward Lear, and I can't explain why I'm doing that, except that I just really like Edward Lear, and I just wondered who he was. So I bought a biography of him. I read a book by a writer named Joe Abercrombie. He's a British writer, not particularly well known here in America, which is odd because he is a genius. His books are just, if you have any taste for heroic fantasy at all, which I do, I just can't recommend his work highly enough. It is so thoughtful and brilliantly written and funny and humane. He is definitely one of the writers who I read in the hopes that some of whatever he has will rub off on me. I'm looking around my desk to see if I'm reading anything else of note.
Oh, I do
I
the same thing.
I
Whenever
re-
people ask, I'm like, oh, where are my books?
I reread books a lot. I'm rereading Kate Atkinson, Life After Life, which is another one of those touchstones books for me that I just reread periodically. Uh, yeah, I think that's all I've got for you. Oh wait, I'm reading. What am I reading to my kids? I'm reading the Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander, which is that's a fantasy series that was very important to me as a child. I don't hear so much about it anymore. It's very rooted in Welsh mythology, which has a lot to do with King Arthur. I've been endlessly toiling on a book about King Arthur for about 5 years now, and anything remotely Arthurian, I will consume avidly and inflict on my children if at all possible. And so far, the Book of Three is going over pretty well.
Well, that sounds really exciting, and I do actually remember I just sold that book to somebody the other day. So, we do have them in the store if any inquiring minds would like to pick one up.
Strongly, strongly recommend.
And we do have one more question, again from Evelyn. Um, she says, "You've given so much voice to so many endangered creatures in the Silver Arrow, and unfortunately, monarch butterflies are seemingly joining the ranks of the pangolins and fishing cats. And will we be seeing butterflies or other insects in future books?"
Um, I'll tell you the truth about that. I know more than I should about at this point about the sequel to the Silver Arrow, and I'm going to try not to say anything substantive about it. I try to I try to draw from a sort of selection of different parts of the animal kingdom for the characters in the Silver Arrow, and I didn't do any insects. And I'm not sure in retrospect what why that is. I like insects. If I'm personally an avid fan of the Kung Fu Panda films, and I always liked the praying mantis, that they had a praying mantis in the Furious Five. At the same time, I feel like they did the mantis thing, and I've got to do something that's not a mantis. Where my mind was heading toward honeybees, I felt like they ought to they ought to just get a hive of honeybees, and the hive would be a character, and they would be kind of like a hive mind and speak with a very nasal, buzzy voice that everybody could hear. I'm just spitballing here. I'm not committing to anything, but I was going to go with honeybees. Although it's intriguing to think about a butterfly. I need to think about what a butterfly's voice would sound like. Now my mind is working on that.
Well, I'm glad to hear that we could set your wheels spinning. It looks like we have a little shout out from the third graders at the Fayweather Street School. They are all loving the Silver Arrow, and so they are very excited to hear from you tonight. Um, and so, I have one parting question. Do you have any advice for new and future young writers who might be listening tonight?
Um, I really do, and I have lots of advice, so I'm just going to try to edit it down to 30 seconds worth of advice. I think that the it took me a long time to find my feet and find my voice as a writer. I was a notably unsuccessful writer for a very long time, especially for somebody who worked very hard at it and really wanted to be a writer. Was I didn't really have any success for about 15 years after I started writing. And if you are a young writer, it won't take you that long. I was an outlier in that respect. I was an exceptionally bad young writer, and young and even kind of middle-aged writer before I got anywhere with my writing. And throughout that time, I watched other people who I knew become successful as writers, and I watched other people who I knew give up and quit because it was just really difficult to keep working when no one's responding to your things. And honestly, if I had been a more rational person, I probably would have given up because the world was telling me very clearly that writing was not something that I was particularly good at, and maybe I should get into some other line of work. And I couldn't. And in retrospect, I'm really glad that I didn't give up. And what I usually tell young writers is if it's taking longer than it seems like it should, that's okay. Just don't give up. If you keep looking, your voice is in there and you'll find it. If I found it, anybody can find it. And it probably won't take 15 years.
Well, thank you so much for that advice. I mean, sometimes it's hard to hear that it's going to be hard, but not giving up. And then someday you will also have amazing books that we can sell at Belmont Books. So
And it will all feel like it was worth it. It really will.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Lev. And to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for coming. It means the world to us at Belmont Books, and I'm sure to Lev as well, to know how much love his book is receiving. So thank you all so much for coming. Don't forget that you can get your own copy of Silver Arrow at Belmont Books. I put a link in the chat, but you can also just go to belmontbooks.com, go to the event for tonight, and it'll be just right there at the bottom. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Stay safe, everyone, and enjoy the snow.
Enjoy the snow.